Burton, I think everyone would agree that you have really picked our interest in the book, and you have given us a very good, view of how the Chinese position on the conflicts in the region have evolved, and how China has also adjusted in terms of its own interest. One of the things which I noticed also while going through the book and during your discussion is that most of the discussion on China and the Middle East focuses on the economic aspect of Chinese, involvement in the Middle East. It's all about economy, energy, and so on and so forth. But what you have done in the book is that you have taken the focus slightly away and talked about how China has evolved in terms of its engagement with the conflicts. And this also brings and if we look at the questions which are raised in India on China, in terms of what kind of power China is, and we keep kind of discussing a lot in terms of whether China is a disruptive power. It is a global power now. It is one of the most prominent rising power in the world. And whether it is a disruptive power or is it more a constructive power? I would say, the opinion still remains divided, even though with the current, developments, especially in India, I would say the opinion is kind of moving away in one direction. Perhaps you can, and with your experience of studying the Chinese involvement in the Middle East, perhaps you can give some comments on that. We have a few questions already here, but perhaps you can, if you want to react to this point, perhaps you can start with that, and then we can take some more questions.
Yeah, well, thank you, and that's actually a really interesting point, which is like, what is China's orientation? And I think sometimes this is one of the problems that I find with some of the IR literature, that it's kind of it tries to sort of establish these kind of positions in a very discrete manner, whereas actually there's kind of a lot of things, it's sometimes you can be straddling or transcending some of these concepts at the same time. So if you go back and look in, about 15-20 years ago, a lot of the discussion around sort of the rise of these emerging powers, post 2001, there was a big debate, and I'm not talking about just China, because also India was combined in there, and Brazil, the BRICS. There was a debate and discussion as to, are these rising powers, to what extent are they going to support the international system? Because they've benefited from the economic opportunities they've gained through globalization and free trade, and because of that, that's their base. Their economic base has given them the capacity to be able to project on the world stage. So they have a reason to support that international system. But on the other side, these are countries from the global south, from the developing world. They do not necessarily share, identity with, the hegemon. So if we think about, again, if we go back to the BRICS, Brazil does, at least until recently, it did not see itself as being part of, America's backyard, right? So there is this sort of sense of, we do want to transform the world. We want to change it, make the system reflect our rise more effectively. And I guess if we're thinking about countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, one of the key points for them was always membership on the UN Security Council, right? So there is this sense that actually, the literature sort of distinguishes between these two, but actually there's this kind of blurring, if you want to call it that. And if you look at China in the Middle East, there is this sense that actually on the one hand, it does not, it's opposed to American dominance, but on the other hand, it's benefited from American dominance, right? So and in a way, this is where I sort of come back to the point I made about, post 2003, the American occupation. Okay, granted, we may debate whether or not it provided that much security on the ground, but America was effectively the main security provider, to Iraq, and it was in the context of that security provision that the Chinese were able to make their economic, advances. So, they actually China benefited really from the American presence there, so much to the point that actually in 2014, Obama grumbled about China free riding, on American security. And so this is something that I think we need to think about going forward, because one thing that deeply frustrates me is, especially in the mainstream media, there is a lot of this debate and discussion. There's a lot of this talk about, well, America's withdrawing from the region, it's retreating from the region, so therefore, China must somehow fill it in, as if the tide is going out, so something else must come in. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. It's looking at things from, in a very crude way and not taking into account how Beijing sees it. And I think, it makes sense to actually sort of take on board the Chinese worldview. I mean, I think several, there's been a number of people who've looked at this. From Kerry Brown and at King's in London through to other studies, which point out that the Chinese view of the world is can be sort of portrayed as a series of concentric circles. So the highest priority, the most important thing that matters to the Chinese leadership, is the party, and the party maintaining its control over the country. Then it's about the homeland, right? Control over the Chinese heartland, Shanghai, through to Guangzhou and elsewhere. Then the border regions, sort of the more problematic ones, that places like Tibet, Xinjiang, which you have a sort of a more precarious relationship between society and the state. Beyond that, then you're looking at the littoral, you're looking at Taiwan, you're looking at South China Sea. These are the priorities for China, for the Chinese leadership. It is about ensuring its security at home and in its home neighborhood, rather than sort of abroad. Yes, I mean, it's nice to have influence in the Middle East, but as I flagged up with sort of the debate, that the discussion that's gone on with Syrian reconstruction, it's been much more about the Syrians saying the Chinese can come in and help. The Chinese have not done anything here, but that conversation, when it's sort of projected through media and stuff, makes the Chinese look good. It makes them look more like a global power. So I don't know if that helps a little bit with what you're asking.
I think that really gives a very good idea of what exactly how academic looks at the developments and how the popular debate most of the time kind of makes it into very crude, very simplistic dimensions of any issue. And China obviously gets a lot of attention these days. We have Professor Koichiro Tanaka from Japan with us. May I request Professor to please ask your question if you can?
Well, could you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Burton, for your excellent presentation, and I'm really interested in getting hold of the copy of your latest book. Now, my question is about the Chinese policy vis-a-vis non-proliferation. Now, we've seen, as you have rightly mentioned and pointed out, that during the JCPOA, or the formation of the JCPOA, the negotiations that led to JCPOA, PRC played a very positive role trying to help the two sides, mainly the Americans and the Europeans on one side, and the Iranians not to leave the negotiating table. And I think that their interest, the Chinese interest here, is that they don't want to see a turmoil in the region, as well as not to see any other state becoming a de facto nuclear state. So it's Iran. So now, given that sort of a traditional, or maybe sort of a long-standing position by the Chinese, now we've seen some sort of a report coming from the Wall Street Journal, I believe, about a month ago, when it talked about a facility, nuclear facility being built inside the Saudi kingdom with the help of the Chinese, without the consent or any sort of a reporting to the IAEA and also to the public. Now, if this report happens to be true, I'm quite wondering what sort of a change or any sort of a dynamics, what sort of a dynamics here might have played into the idea for the Chinese to proceed with a cooperation, nuclear cooperation of this nature.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a good point, because I mean, I flag up in the chapter on China and Iran that actually China's committed to non-proliferation, both globally as well as within the region. And but it also says at the same time that it supports nuclear programs and participation in nuclear programs so long as they're peaceful. And actually, the Chinese were involved in Iran's nuclear program, during the 1980s. And into the, during the 1980s, it pulls out in 1997, and actually it pulls out less because of its individual relationship with Iran, and more about because of the prospect of better relations with the United States, which is an interesting thing. So when you think about that so if you think about in a triangular relationship between the US, Iran, and China, the US is always far more important for both of them, for the other two than each other. So the Chinese pulled out of that, and it was and after the sort of the development of Iran's nuclear program post 2002, when the Europeans start to take the lead in trying to sort of mediate and manage and contain the program, you see the Chinese accepting, yes, non-proliferation is what we want, but at the same time, we don't want too tough a sanctions regime. They go along with sanctions, but so long as they're not too tough. And I think there is this kind of sort of balancing act that they're constantly trying to do. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, you're quite right. I mean, it does seem odd that in the context of all of this, why on earth would they have sort of agreed to, signing up to a nuclear program? I guess at this moment, it's based on the assumption that, yes, this is going to be, a civilian program. Yes, there's no, that it's not got any kind of military intent, although any kind of nuclear program has, potential dual use. So this is problematic, but at the same time, I think, maybe they kind of are fitting it in, because bear in mind that China has a comprehensive strategic partnership, which is the highest level of partnership it can have with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. And part of its goals with Saudi Arabia is to sort of cooperate in the diversification of energy, or diversification of economic activity and energy. So beyond just oil and gas, to include things like nuclear power. So I guess that's kind of where they're sitting in. But as you say, we've only recently heard about this from the WSJ. Right. I mean, I think it's going to become, I mean, as and when things become more concrete and we have some clearer ideas of, how willing are the Saudis to actually, follow up, to align themselves with things like the atomic agencies, the atomic authorities, requirements, then we might see whether the Chinese will be going further down that path or pulling back a bit. But it's also interesting to look at how, they made this decision in complete isolation from their, relations with Iran, which sort of says to me that there's, some people sort of, I mean, this is another sort of, cliche that I find really frustrating about sort of, China as this kind of like omnipotent, wise, strategic, actor, when in actual fact, a lot of this stuff could just be being done, on short-term transactional basis. We don't know, because a lot of the decision-making is taking place within a very small coterie of people around Xi Jinping. So.
Great. Well, thank you for your explanation. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Since we are discussing Saudi Arabia and China and the issues related to that, we had a question by Mr. Nadeem Ahmed. Nadeem, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. First of all, let me at the outset thank the presentation and the presenter. I mean, obviously it was a very insightful engagement overall. I'll keep my question very short. I mean, the energy partnership for Saudi Arabia with China still remains important, as Beijing is still, a premier client of Saudi oil. However, the present functional relationship between Saudi Arabia and its allies with China does not seem to replace America in Riyadh's worldview. So in that case, how much significance does China actually hold when it comes to regional conflicts or crisis? And would or could Beijing take any significant steps for mediation between rivals be it in Persian Gulf or Eastern Mediterranean? And how would it imply in the overall regional stability of Middle East? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question, Nadeem. I mean, the Chinese approach has been primarily to sort of focus on sort of economic, commercial relations more than security. Although there is, there is a growing security partnership as part of these kind of interactions that it has, including in the Gulf and with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. But what it tries to make clear is that this is not going to be sort of offensive, that this is, you know, more just a sort of a point of contact. And certainly there's no desire on either the Saudi or the Chinese to, you know, challenge or replace the United States. But I think, you know, we've also got to keep in mind, you know, the United States itself, under Trump, it's become there has been an increasing degree of unreliability. So this has actually created, you know, its own problems in the Gulf. So you've seen Gulf, not just the Saudis, but the Emiratis, the Qataris and others, trying to hedge against this as well. So you're seeing a diversification of security relations and partnerships by these actors to compensate for, you know, uncertainty around the United States. So it's actually sort of a two-way process. The other thing you also flagged up about energy. I mean, I wrote a report for the Burson Institute, you know, in Brussels earlier in the year, in which, you know, I was looking at sort of connectivity between Asia and the Gulf. And one of the interesting things is, of course, yes, you know, energy is still seen as, you know, the paramount point of, or the paramount vector between, you know, Asia/China and the region, but it's not the only one. And I think this is something we need to kind of move away from, this obsession that it's always about oil and gas. What you're seeing is, you know, because obviously the Gulf countries themselves are trying to diversify, they want to diversify their economies, and you are seeing, you know, a broadening and a widening and a deepening of the economic exchange that is taking place between, you know, Gulf states and Asian states. You are seeing a lot more foreign investment, you know, by the sovereign wealth funds. You know, the Saudi one, the largest one, the Public Investment Fund, has invested massively, you know, in Asia. It's investing in healthcare, it's investing in real estate, a lot of that in the Chinese market. So likewise, you're seeing the Chinese doing similar, you know, obviously trying to diversify. So this is obviously spreading the risk a little bit as well. Of course, as well, you know, yes, also, I think what's worth keeping in mind is currently this year with obviously COVID, that's seen oil prices crash. And of course, that was very beneficial for the Chinese because they were able to sort of pick up, you know, at very low cost. So in that sense, the relationship was skewed much more towards the Chinese than it was to the Saudis. And also keep in mind that currently, you know, even though OPEC Plus has agreed, you know, to a certain level of production cuts in order to keep prices at around $40 a barrel, this is still $40 less than the Saudis need to break even. So, you know, the Saudis are, you know, really do need to diversify.
Thanks, Guy. We have Ambassador Sanjay Singh with us. Ambassador Singh has served as India's ambassador in Tehran, and he was also the secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Sir, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Muddassir. That was a very interesting talk, and I quite enjoyed listening to it. I'm sorry, my internet connection seemed to be giving trouble. So I'll try and ask a question. You've described the steady transformation of Chinese approach to the region and what motivates their relationships in the region. As China grows, as China assumes greater strength, comprehensive national power, as they put it, how will it change transform its relationship with the region? Will it go into setting norms and rules, which BRI to an extent does? And will it go beyond being just transactional to a larger engagement which may not be immediately beneficial to itself?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question, Ambassador Singh. I mean, this is ultimately one of, you know, a question that we don't really have an answer for because it depends on the nature of the Middle East, you know, how it will evolve. You know, we're currently in this state where the regional system is in a state of fragmentation, you know, where you have a series of, you know, failed and failing states. You've got both, you know, regional states as well as non-state actors like ISIS who've tried to exploit that, you know. So you've had a series of sort of proxy conflicts that have taken place, whether it's in Syria, well, I mean, obviously there are domestic reasons for that, but also Iran, Saudi, the Qataris, Turks, and others have tried to exploit those conflicts to their own advantage. And so basically, how do the Chinese navigate all of that? To a large part, they've tried to sit out from these particular, conflicts. What we've seen is, in a way, on the Syrian war, it's pretty much deferred to the Russians, allowed the Russians to do much of the running in terms of providing a counterweight to the Western position on Syria. In the case of Libya, where you've effectively got, yes, series of militias at the grassroots levels, but crudely, two poles, operating. The Chinese kind of sort of sat back and say, we're willing to engage and interact, but we need to know, we want a unified government. We want a solution that is settled by the Libyans themselves. Although interestingly, at certain points, it has had contact and engagement with both sides. So often, the Chinese position is to say that we support the officially recognized government, whether that's in Yemen or in Libya, but it has also had, contacts, whether it was with, Haftar's, sort of Tobruk government in Libya, or with the Houthis, who had sent a delegation to Beijing. So I think, there is this idea of sort of trying to keep, talking to both sides, but not necessarily, coming down on one side or the other. And that may well work for now. But as I also said in my sort of closing remarks, Belt and Road, one of the things it's going to do is, it's a very open-ended, ambiguous, vague project. There's no map, there's no specific countries, anyone can sign up to it, but it also has potential unintended consequences, and one of those may be that as China becomes more and more invested, in a country, as its state companies become more involved in those countries, it's going to need to become more involved in terms of providing security. What we saw in Iraq, for example, post 2003, was that a lot of the I flagged up the point that the Chinese benefited under American security provision, but what was interesting was that much of China's contracts with the Iraqi authorities and the oil companies was really in the south of the country. So when you had that whole ISIS advance in the spring and summer of 2014, that swept across Iraq from Syria, much of what was Chinese interests were not affected. I think there was one installation that was affected and they abandoned it. But they were helped by, they were in that respect, they were not directly affected by, sort of the instability that generated as a result. However, there has been some discussion since then about, what is the most appropriate way for China to, ensure security for these kind of investments and for these infrastructure projects. Typically, they've supported, that national government, national forces will provide that kind of assistance. But as we've seen, in a place like Iraq, where you've got, the state is relatively weak in places, there's been a reliance on militias and on these patriotic military units. So there is an increasing pressure in China for the establishment of, I guess, kind of equivalent of Blackwater, Chinese security companies to provide protection to their workers and projects in these countries. That's of course a unilateral individual approach, but of course if you're thinking about sort of broader sort of security cooperation, I mean that's going on as we've seen. They're taking part in various naval exercises with the Iranians. They've done this with the Gulf. With the Arab Gulf countries, but always with the idea of, we do not want to get involved in your conflicts. But if we need to, they have also offered to mediate as well. There's been offers, for example, if you think back to 2017 and the crisis between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side and Qatar on the other, the Chinese were worried about that. They feared what that might do for their own investments in the region as well as those countries' investments in China. And so they offered to mediate, but they neither pushed that very hard, nor did they sort of, and actually, to be honest with you, when the Kuwaitis stepped in, the Chinese were very happy with that as an alternative. I'm sorry, it's a very roundabout route to answering the question, but I hope.
Thank you very much. Would you hazard a guess into when hubris will set in?
Sorry?
When hubris will set in?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Would you hazard a guess when
Yes.
China hubris will set in?
Hubris will say,
I missed that. Sorry, Muddassir. It wasn't coming through to me.
He's talking about when hubris will set in.
Ah, yes. Well, there is always that risk, isn't there? And I mean, this is one of the things. And I think, you know, if we want to look at maybe the Middle East isn't the place to look for. Maybe closer to home is. And I think, you know, this is one of the things where I think, you know, we look at, you know, China's military strategy in relation to, you know, what it's going to do about the South China Sea, or, you know, in relation to Taiwan. There is a risk, of course, you know, that, I mean, what it's trying to do is to try and, you know, advance its interests and to be as assertive as possible and to be as coercive as possible, while not, you know, resorting to all-out war, trying to get what it wants without having to fight for it. There is always the danger that it might overstep. I mean, one of the things, so I don't know if that sort of, you know, touches on some of those points, but certainly I think, for example, if we go back and think about, you know, one of the things that is interesting, because I see there was another question earlier, which is like, what do Middle East people think, or what does the Middle East society think about China? And the answer to that is not very much, right? There's if you look at, there's some really good, you know, polling by Pew data, which looks at sort of, you know, different countries, and there's generally sort of, I guess, a sort of a favorable opinion towards China, partly because they don't know much about China. But what is interesting is that, you know, when the Islamic State, you know, swept into Mosul in Iraq in 2014, and, you know, Abu Baghdadi, you know, made his sermon, he didn't just target the West, he targeted, you know, some of the countries from the global South, including India and China. And, you know, talked about, you know, our Muslim brothers in Xinjiang. So, you know, there is this idea that, you know, Middle East and China are very far away, but actually they're not that far away either. So,
yeah, I think thanks a lot, Dr. Burton. I think that you know, answers a lot of questions which were asked earlier also. We have a couple of more questions. If you allow, we can perhaps extend it a bit. Dr. Moinuddin Ahmed wanted to ask a question. Moinuddin, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Burton. You've just you know, answered my question. I was concerned about the popular perception of China, because China has been in the imagination of people from the Middle East. And my only concern was that, is China seen as an inclusive superpower coming to the Middle East? But you know, partially you've answered my question. But if you have anything more to say, that will only add to my knowledge. Thank you.
Well, I mean, and just to sort of add to that, I mean, obviously there's been quite, you know, been a bit of discussion, especially last year, when a number of the countries in the region, you know, put their name to, or agree, you know, sort of signed a letter saying that the Chinese position on Xinjiang was totally acceptable, you know, that there wasn't any problems with, but it's also important to keep in mind that these were governments, right, rather than sort of, you know, societies. And whereas I think, you know, so there is this, obviously so there is this sense that sometimes put out that, you know, the Chinese and you know, the Chinese and and governments in the Middle East are as one when it comes to Xinjiang and to the Uyghurs, but that's debatable. And it also, and that's actually comes back to, you know, to asking to the point that Ambassador Singh asked about, you know, hubris. One of the dangers, of course, for the Chinese is that, you know, by engaging too much or relying too much on its relationships with the region's governments, you know, it runs the risk that that previous, you know, hegemonic powers have had, which is, you know, that you rely on these guys, and when these guys fall, you have nobody else. We saw that in 2011. You know, the Americans were caught in a really difficult position when the protests started against Mubarak, because Egypt had always been a reliable ally, you know, for the United States. But then suddenly, you know, Obama was caught with in his own rhetoric, having been in Egypt 2 years earlier, talking about the importance of democracy and human rights. How could he then, you know, defend Mubarak? And so, you know, the Americans found it very difficult to sort of, you know, straddle both sides. Now, the Chinese don't have that problem because they've never talked about democracy and human rights. But what they do, but the problem is that by relying too much on the governments and basing their relations in the region on those states, if we see further sort of intifadas and uprisings and people being thrown out, that could be very problematic for the Chinese.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. We Alvite, would you like to come in now? You wanted to ask something?
Yes, Alvite.
Yes, Alvite.
Talked about on book. So that mentioned,
Alvite,
yeah.
your voice is not clear. If you can perhaps try and switch off the video, maybe there would be more bandwidth for audio. We can't hear you, Alvite. Maybe you can come a little later, or maybe I can read your question. We have Professor Grijesh Pant also with us, who has been engaged in the study of Gulf region and the Middle East for a very long time. So, if you are here, would you like to ask a question or any comment? It seems there is some network problem at Alvite's end.
So you can probably read the question.
Yeah, I'll rather read the question. So Alvite wanted to ask about in which potential areas, according to you, are China-Middle East cooperation going to pose a major challenge to India's Middle East policy? So some sort of a comparative, about India's engagement with the region and Chinese engagement with the Middle East. And, whether growing partnership with Iran, especially in the current news about the long-term strategic cooperation plan between China and Iran. So how should India react to that? What kind of reaction, if you can shed some light on that?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, so yeah, I just read the question as well. I mean, I guess so. As I understand it, sort of the Indian, sort of much of the bulk of India's Middle East policy, such as it is, is focused around the Gulf, and actually that's kind of similar, actually, I think, for China as well. The depth, or sort of the intensity and the depth of the relations are much greater in the Gulf region than they are elsewhere. And in that sense, I think, there is actually some complementarity that's going on. The more projects, the more sort of Belt and Road projects that, that come to the Gulf, the more possibility there is for construction work projects that, a lot of, South Asians, work on. So there is that opportunity there. I mean, I guess if you're asking more specifically about the case of Iran, because of course there has been over the course of over the summer, sort of talk about, the Iranians getting frustrated with the Indians over sort of the Chabahar, development of the Chabahar port, and sort of looking to the Chinese as an alternative there, and of course the Indian, ministerial visits to Iran to sort of, bolster its position there. I mean, I guess for me, the way I see it is that this is maybe an over, there's maybe too much being made of China in relation to Iran. Yes, I mean, there's this sort of geopolitical rivalry that goes on between sort of the Indian sponsorship of the Chabahar port and sort of the Chinese sponsorship of the Gwadar port in Pakistan, just over the border. I mean, some of these, I mean, just as much as we can see, competition between them, we could also see them as possibly complementary as well. But in the case of, sort of this report that came out earlier this summer about, the Sino-Iranian relations was about to go to the next level, that China was about to invest, up to 400 billion in the next 25 years. I mean, a lot of this is somewhat overblown. And I mean, if anyone's interested, I mean, I'd urge you to sort of look at my colleague, Jakopos Skita's piece in The Responsible Statecraft, in which he basically looks at that agreement and says that actually, there's nothing really new here, in the sense that, this is actually more detail on the 2016 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that was agreed between China and Iran. It just puts more flesh on the details. But B, number two, there's not that, it doesn't really say anything about money, about how much is actually going to be invested. So this 400 billion is something that's been, it's among, especially among those who are students of Iran and China more so than I, question that. Because if you, it's similar sort of claims were made around this time last year in a Petroleum Economist article. If you actually go and look at what China's invested, in Iran over the last 15 odd years, American Enterprise Institute does a really good, tracker of Chinese investments around the world. And in 15 years, it's invested probably around or just under 25 to 30 billion. So, the idea that somehow we're going to suddenly see this escalation of 400 billion seems a bit extreme. So, I would not put too much weight on that, on that particular idea. And also, finally, the last thing I want to also point out is that actually, and this is not just unique to Iran, but in many cases, the relationship between China and ex-Middle East state is one that is much more skewed towards the Chinese than it is towards the others, right? So the Iranians need the Chinese far more than the Chinese need the Iranians. So, so this is actually, so a lot of this actually came out of Iran, and part of it was, partly to try and sort of boost its own status, to say, look, we are not an international pariah. We're handling, the American maximum pressure sanctions against us because we're friends with China. But the Chinese have not said we're going to go and invest 400 billion. So,
thanks. I think that clarifies a lot of. You're right. In a way, it was more of posturing in terms of trying to create a posture, a perception in the global media, rather than just. Obviously there are certain realities, but it's not something new. There's one final last question. If I can extend a bit of your time. There was, I think partly you have touched upon this about the tension between Russia, Iran on the one hand, and China on the other, especially vis-a-vis Syria. And especially since you were also talking about the reconstruction project, perhaps if you can shed some light on that, and then we can kind of.
Absolutely. I see the question because it's asking me, how does China assess its competition with Iran and Russian firms while pursuing peace through development? And given that Russia and Iran are leveraging their supports to Assad, for context. Look, this is again, so China, again, I shall come back to the point that it's actually it's just as with Iran, the Syrians have been doing this, which is to sort of, point out that we have friends, we're not international pariahs, we don't need the West, we don't need, sort of aid from America or the European Union or from Turkey. We can get it. And okay, yes, our allies, the Russians and Iranians, are sort of struggling with sanctions and stuff. We can get funds from China. The Chinese have, Chinese firms, some Chinese firms have been looking at the potential for investment in Syria, but it is also one that is, not generated much in the last few years. And it's unlikely to do so until things become a lot more stable and secure. Ultimately, these are business people making business decisions, and they want to be absolutely sure that there is going to be stability and order, before they put their money down. Now, that, and even if the Chinese did do that, that actually creates tensions with the Russians and the Iranians, who sort of sit there and think, well, we've actually invested not just, money, but we've invested, men here as well. So there isn't this sense of, there is this, interestingly enough, there is when, on things like the JCPOA, the Iranians, Chinese, and Russians are all of a like mind. They believe that the JCPOA should continue to operate. They oppose the American maximum pressure against it. And yet when it comes to Syria, they've all got their own internal interests, their own self-interest, and that shouldn't surprise us. They will, what often, I think this is one of the key points to make about all of this, that is that, instead of looking at these, instead of taking this kind of sort of global or sort of, bird's eye view and trying to sort of see everything through the prism of, is this good for, if this happens, is this good for this bunch of people and less good for this bunch of people, and to look at it on its own, in its own terms. And so that actually makes for, much more sort of sometimes it looks pretty confusing. is that what China does in Saudi Arabia or in Syria is completely at odds with what it does in Yemen or Iran. But I think that is kind of the way we have to look at things, I'm afraid. Now, like, as I said, I don't think there's much interest in sort of, investing at the moment in Syria, at least in any substantial amounts. But, it is also a test, because, if they are serious about this idea of peace through development, this is really, the best place to experiment and to give it a go. Because I think with the other conflicts like Yemen and Libya, we're not yet at the point where, the wars are coming to an end. There's still a lot more to play out there. In Syria, we seem to be coming to an end. But the problem is that the Chinese don't really have anything to say on things to do with, sort of transitional justice, on what happens for, for the victims of the war, in terms of sort of, the return of refugees. There's not really any, conversation going on there. So.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. I think everyone would agree that this was a very wonderful exposition on China's growing and expanding, in terms of not just a deepening engagement, but in terms of the vastness of its engagement also. And we really look forward to, get hold of your book and read it, and also have you more with us on various, issues which you work on. And thank you also for your patience with all the questions and answering all the questions.